Hello, Aeneas Tacticus here. Today I'm going to be talking about ancient Greek body armor. Now this video is kind of a response video to Lindybeige's video about the hoplite cuirass. Lindybeige does a lot of historical videos and they're usually pretty good. I like them a lot. But in this case, there are some serious inaccuracies in the video that I thought I needed to address. So in this video, Lindybeige basically kind of asserts that this particular style of Greek armor, variously called by different people a Linothorax, a tube and yoke cuirass, or type 4 armor, I think is the scholarly name for it. But anyways, he asserts that this kind of armor is made out of leather and that the idea that it was made out of linen is ridiculous and there is no historical evidence for it. So this is just kind of wrong, and this is my response to that. So let's look at some images of what armor I'm actually talking about here. So I said this earlier, but this armor is variously called a linothorax, a tube and yoke cuirass, or the scholarly name again is type 4 armor. So linothorax means quite literally from the Greek linen chest. Thorax is, the Greeks use it to mean chest armor, but the word is literally chest. But linothorax can be translated as linen corselet. Tube and yoke, some reenacting type people call it a tube and yoke cuirass just because it kind of has a tube around the body and then those kind of shoulder pieces, kind of like a yoke. So yep, that's why they call it that. And then type 4 armor, it's just kind of a scholarly classification. So this armor is actually featured kind of widely in the media. You can see it in lots of video games, like the Total War series features quite prominently in that. In some different movies, Alexander the Great is probably, the Alexander movie is probably the big one there. And then also in Lindybeige's video, he discusses it, and that's kind of why I'm making this video. And then this armor is also seen in hundreds and hundreds of pieces of Greek art, and also not just Greek art, but art in in Italy and other places. So this armor was, from all the artistic evidence, we can tell this was a really commonly used armor, and the appearance is kind of the armor of the stereotypical Greek hoplite when he's not wearing that bronze armor that looks like a guy with some wicked muscles. So this armor appears everywhere. There's a ton of art about it, but it seems that it was made of a organic material. So we can tell that from some of the visual evidence we have, but also there haven't really been any surviving armor of this type. I'll talk about that a bit later. But in this video, I'm basically going to talk about the debate about what this armor is actually made out of. So I'm going to be discussing the literary evidence, the archaeological evidence, and the economic evidence for this armor and what it was made out of. And basically in this video I'm going to be arguing that it was made out of linen primarily rather than leather, as Lindybeige suggests. So these mentions of linen armor occur in all kinds of contexts, and actually this armor seems to have been known all across the Mediterranean world. Some of our best actually visual examples of this armor in the art come from Italy. There's a ton of Greek influence in Italy, a lot of Greek settlers, and the Etruscans definitely seem to have used this. But I want to discuss with you some of the literary examples, to show that I'm not just making this up. But we get this linen armor mentioned in all kinds of different sources. Some of them are, very military-related sources. Other ones, you get these kind of mentions in a play. One of the most, like an ancient theater play. Some of the most interesting is actually basically Greek temples. People would give gifts of armor and weapons to the temples. These temples actually were there was an enormous amount of wealth stored in these temples as gifts to the gods, and the temples actually kept really good records about what was stored there. And this armor, linen linothoraxes are actually mentioned all the time in these inventory lists. So yeah, now I'm going to read some references I prepared here. I can't read all the references because there are dozens of them, but yeah, so I'm going to start with the Iliad, the most famous Greek work, the kind of ancient Greek Bible almost, and its significance. But yeah, we've got Lesser Ajax is described as small of stature with a linothorax. The linothorax is mentioned a couple other times in the Iliad. Lindybeige mentions the linen corsleted Argives, the goads of war. Now he says that's the only reference to linen armor. That's just wrong again, but that is a reference to it. It's from a Delphic oracle, and that's actually from something called the Greek Anthology, which is a collection of Greek poems and that kind of thing. But yeah, it's a Delphic oracle prophecy there. So this is from the poet Alcaeus. So he's in this poem he's describing kind of an armory, an arsenal of weapons. So I'll cut to the part with the linothorax here. He says, "Upon each wall the pegs by flashing greaves are hidden all against swift darts, brazen bulwarks strong, and by new linen corslets and a throng of curved shields." So a mention of linen corslets here from the play Epigonoi by Sophocles. We have, "And for the wearers of breastplates, the weavers are striking up the wise shuttles, songs that wake up those who are asleep." So here, this is not an explicit reference to linen armor, but we have basically so it's in a play, but they're referencing that in times of war, the weavers are weaving breastplates. So, you know, they're not weaving those out of leather. They'd be weaving them out of most likely linen here. So the next couple quotes are from this epic poem that's hundreds of pages long called the Punica. It's an epic poem about the Punic Wars by this guy, Silius Italicus, who was he had some military experience. He was a Roman guy. So in one part of the poem, someone throws a spear at a guy wearing this armor, and the spear sped through the many layers of linen. So that, again, that's implying this is a piece of armor with many layers of linen, obviously. And then at a different point, the corselet with its many folds of linen protected his body. So yeah, this is pretty, I think, in my opinion, pretty clearly stating this is a piece of linen with lots of layers of protection in it. So this is, I think, the last quote I'm going to give you. There are tons more. These are just some interesting ones I found. So this one is actually from Cassius Dio, and he's describing an incident with the Roman Emperor Caracalla. So this is actually much past the Greek period, but you'll see why it's interesting in a minute. So this Emperor Caracalla was obsessed with everything Macedonian. I mean, he even, one of his officers, he found out he was a Macedonian, and then he found out his name was Antigonus, and he was the son of Philip. As a side note, Antigonus and Philip are the names of some famous Macedonian kings from, centuries before. But, he finds out this tribune is a Macedonian. He has these amazing Macedonian names, weighty historical Macedonian names. He's like, man, you have all that I want. Literally, that's what he says. And basically, he promotes the guy. Nothing to do with his necessarily ability. I don't think he was a bad guy, but you know, his promotion is due to his Macedonian heritage. You know, Caracalla was obsessed with Alexander the Great in Macedon. So Caracalla actually decides to equip some of his legions as a Macedonian phalanx. So here I'll start the quote. He organized a phalanx composed entirely of Macedonians, 16,000 strong, named it Alexander's Phalanx, and equipped it with arms used in his day, Alexander's day. These consisted of a helmet of raw oxide, a 3-ply linen breastplate, a bronze shield, long pike, short spear, high boots, and sword. Now, I'm not sure quite on the accuracy of a raw oxide helmet, but a 3-ply linen breastplate is mentioned. Even if, so this is an armor that's associated with the ancient Greeks and Macedonians, this linen, multi-layered, 3-ply, multi-layered linen armor. Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about the literary evidence for leather armor. So most of the argument for leather armor revolves around this one word, spolas, which is defined as an armor made out of leather by this 2nd century AD writer. So writing quite a bit after the time period that this armor was used. But the word spolas does occur in previous writings. It's called, it's described as a leather armor that hangs from the shoulders. Now, that's really not very descriptive. Some people have latched on the idea that this is the Linothorax type 4 tube and yoke whatever armor because of this hangs from the shoulders, but pretty much every armor hangs from the shoulders. This armor, that's not really a very descriptive term, and actually in a lot of images we see the tube part fastened around a chest with the shoulder pieces up, so this armor did not even necessarily hang from the shoulders, but okay. So then what other context is this word spolas used by? So Xenophon, who's one of the greatest ancient Greek writers out there, he uses the word quite a bit, but he doesn't actually say what it is. Since it pops up, people kind of assume that spolas is armor, but it's kind of a complicated fact. He says this guy was pierced through his shield and his spolas by an arrow. So spolas could be the armor, or it could not. He never actually says this is what a spolas is. It's just like the same word. So then in another piece of writing, the Libyans are described as wearing a spolas of leopard skin. And this is, if you do some digging, basically what you see the Libyans wearing is this kind of cloak, this leather or leopard skin cloak over one shoulder. So it's kind of this leather thing hanging from the shoulder, but it's not exactly this, piece of armor. And a third kind of piece of evidence about the spolas is in this play. Let me just look that up real quick. It's, the play The Birds by Aristophanes. You have, so there's this kind of poor poet in the play, and then this, he's kind of trying to beg for stuff, basically, and a master and his slave are walking by, and the master says to the slave, take off your spolas and give it to this begging poet. So, this word spolas comes up again, and it's like, a slave is wearing a spolas. This is supposed to be a piece of leather armor. That just doesn't really make sense. And then, why would he be giving it to the poor beggar poet? That just doesn't, in that context, this word spolas is, it doesn't make sense as a piece of armor. So, what I've heard, and this is also the definition, I think the official classical dictionary definition of spolas is of a leather outer tunic. Um, Now, in the case of Xenophon, um, he might be using spolas as a slang term for armor again, but he never says it's leather. It's some other guy who says it's made out of leather. Um, so it could be a slang term used by Xenophon, or, this could be kind of this like leather arming tunic, which, spolas could be a word for like a thick leather tunic, over tunic. In the play again, The Birds, it's stated that this slave is wearing a regular kind of tunic underneath it. So it kind of makes sense as this kind of thick leather outer tunic, which, might offer some protection, but again, it's not really this armor we're talking about. Now, in Xenophon, there's this kind of famous line. So Xenophon is outfitting this kind of cavalry force, and because cavalry in ancient Greece at this time didn't use shields on horseback, they actually needed they needed armor to protect themselves. So he's basically trying to gather together armor to outfit these guys, and the passage there says he outfitted them with spolades, the plural of spolas, and thoracides, breastplates. He equipped them with spolases and breastplates. So the tricky thing about this translation is we don't know whether he's saying some guys got a spolas, some guy over here gets a spolas, this guy gets a breastplate. Or if what it's saying is, they got this under tunic of leather and then a breastplate on top of it. It's a confusing matter, but the word spolas doesn't really crop up very often in the ancient writings, I'll say that, compared to mentions to linen armor, which there are hundreds. There just are not those same amount of references to spolas. They're just very few, actually. So that's kind of the evidence for leather armor, this word spolas. I think I've given a pretty good description of it. You can make up your own mind about what they're actually talking about with that. But personally, I find this kind of leather arming tunic argument to be pretty convincing, actually. So the final kind of evidence piece of this video is basically looking at the economic factors involved with the production of linen versus the production of leather. Now, a really common argument for this leather armor is that, leather is really cheap. You can just go out, slaughter any old animal sitting out there, and you got this leather, and you can make this armor out of it. Whereas linen, it comes from this plant flax. You need lots of water to grow it. You need lots of land to grow this flax. So we have this difference between this really expensive, flax that you need tons of fields to grow it in versus leather. You can just go out and grab some random animal and kill it, and you got yourself some armor. Well, the facts are actually quite a bit different than this. So basically, to make a leather armor that's thick enough to actually, work as armor, and Lindybeige actually uses oxhide for shoe soles to make his armor, which is the kind of thick leather you need. So this kind of leather only comes from an oxhide, and only certain parts of that oxhide are actually going to be thick enough for the armor, so you can't even use the whole oxhide. Now, today, I think, in our modern world, we kind of lose touch with how valuable livestock was in the past. I come from dairy country USA. I drive by tons of cows all the time. Ancient Greece wasn't like that. They did not have the kind of dairy industry we have here in the United States. They didn't have the beef industry we have in the United States. These oxen are purely pretty much draft animals. You're not slaughtering these oxen for nothing. They're extremely expensive. One oxen costs the same as your entire, supply of food for a year. Like literally the amount of money an oxen is worth in ancient Greece is the same amount as all the food you could eat in a year, all the food you would need to live in a year, basically. And we know that because we actually have the ancient documents giving the value of different things. So we know how valuable an ox was. So kind of tying into that, the linen question. So people kind of think that they weren't growing linen in ancient Greece. That's actually wrong too. Um, you know, that actually whole idea stems from one throwaway line that a historian wrote in 1970. You know, there wasn't a lot of linen. Well, the Greeks weren't growing linen; they didn't grow it. It's too dry. Um, yeah, it's actually not really true. So I've actually been in doing some investigation here, looking at some recent papers, and you know, it kind of becomes evident that there was a lot of linen production in Greece. You know, just looking at various different literary sources, you have references to you know, women processing parts of the flax plant, processing linen things. You know, so they had to be, they would have to have been growing it for people to have been processing it and processing it enough that it was kind of part of, you know, daily life. So additionally, you know, you have these, they found these Mycenaean tablets. So this is from an earlier era, but it's still, you know, Greece, showing, relating to flax production by a certain group. Well, I think in Messenia, which kind of near Sparta. And not only that, basically you actually have tons and tons of place names in Greece that relate to linen production. You know, the place of the linen worker or something, the place of the flax worker. So stuff like that. And you know, these names are from a more recent time than the time we're talking about, but still it shows that, you know, flax was widely grown in Greece up until relatively recently, maybe, you know, 100 years ago or something like that. So it's, you know, flax was perfectly well be grown in Greece. You know, flax was used for tons of things, sails, clothing, and stuff. You know, people were using a lot of flax. And finally, to add to the domestic production of flax, you know, you had tons of imported linen coming in, you know, from Egypt, but also the Black Sea region. You know, you could be kind of the same argument with the against linen. You could be saying, well, the Greeks didn't eat grain, they didn't eat bread. The Athenians didn't eat grain or bread, they didn't grow any or something. Well, you know, Athens' entire grain supply came from the Black Sea region, you know, kind of where modern day Ukraine is, that kind of area. So, you know, they're actually producing a ton of flax there. You know, a lot of it was probably getting imported to Athens also, and other islands in the Mediterranean we know were producing flax. So I don't, you know, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that flax is a super rare, unobtainable item or something, or that it's way more expensive than the oxhide. I think people are just, you know, it's not some random goat you can make this armor out of. You know, the leather's too thin, for one thing. The second thing is that it's just not large enough to, you know, form, you know, to give you enough material for a piece of armor. So yeah, linen is a lot more available than it's kind of made out to be, a lot cheaper relatively than it's made out to be. Leather is a lot, the right kind of leather is a lot more difficult to produce. It's a lot more expensive to obtain. So, to conclude, what do I think this armor was made out of? So, I think the most likely material for this armor is linen, and this would be kind of laminated in many layers to form, you know, a protective armor. So, yeah, I think, you know, there is a lot of literary evidence for this armor. Linen armor is mentioned scores of times. And then also the economic side of things, linen is much more cost effective than people are often led to believe. Leather is a lot more expensive than people think it is, and the kind of leather you need for armor is a lot harder to obtain than some people kind of imagine here. So yeah, this idea of multiple layers of linen kind of laminated together, I think the first person to kind of really popularized that idea was Peter Connolly. He's kind of a famous guy. Greece and Rome at War is kind of his big book. It's a good book. I recommend checking it out. His kind of ideas have been called into question, but this kind of recent research at it's up in Michigan that they're doing it. I have it. It's sourced in my in the video description here, but they're doing a lot of research into it, and this is kind of what they've turned up, the linen, multiple layers of linen kind of idea here. Yep, so, people, I just want to end with people really get a lot into the leather armor, and I think a lot of the reason why people are kind of obsessed almost with this armor being leather is I think it's kind of a cultural thing, actually. I think, just in movies for, decades, we've been bombarded with leather armor. Leather, I think, is almost synonymous with armor in our minds. I think, a lot of Hollywood Romans are portrayed in this leather armor, and, then you got Mad Max type stuff where they're wearing this kind of leather armor. I think just people think of like leather armor. It makes sense. When you think of linen, what do you think of? Maybe like Egyptian linen sheets or something. You don't really think armor. But what I think they found with this laminating process is that, it makes actually a pretty darn effective armor. You can coat it with beeswax and stuff to make it water resistant too. And they tested that, and it seems it's pretty darn effective, to be honest. And yeah, and I think the other big reason why they think it's this like laminated sheets of linen together is basically we have all these images of the armor where it's like really rigid. We have scenes of people like putting on the armor and stuff. It's got this real rigidity to it, which I think the laminated armor that they've created really matches the same kind of rigidity that they're seeing in these in the artworks that we have. And also, I should add, I think there definitely was quilted armor. You see some images of it. You don't see as many as the standard kind, but I think the quilted armor was definitely out there too. So yeah, thanks for watching. Pretty much most of my sources here are gonna be down there in the description. Whenever I do something, it's a video like this. I do read a lot about this. I've done a lot of research. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Have a nice day.